Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to you all from EFI. Thank you for joining this ThinkForest Ask a Scientist webinar on carbon farming in European forests. I'm Helga Pülzl, EFI's Assistant Director for Policy Support, and I'm really honored to moderate this event today. We have the great opportunity to engage with wonderful scientists that contributed to our From Science to Policy studies on carbon farming in the European forest sector that was published a few months ago. At the start, I will talk a little bit about a couple of housekeeping issues and then introduce the agenda and also the scientists. Please be aware that this webinar is being recorded and we will make it available later on our EFI's YouTube channel. For questions, we have prepared a Padlet where you can write down your questions for the speakers, and then the speakers will answer as many questions as possible. The Padlet address will be accessed through the Q&A. So soon Shan, who is responsible for the Padlet, will share the link. Don't forget to also include your name and your organization to whom the question is directed. It would be very interesting, very important to add. And finally, please don't forget to tag us with the ThinkForest hashtag if you're posting on social media. So now I would like to go quickly through the agenda. As you can see, we have a small introduction to carbon farming and a quick study overview for Tommaso Chiti, who was one of the coordinators. Unfortunately, the second coordinator, Anna Ray, could not be with us, but I'm sure there will be other opportunity to see her also. Then following this, we will set the scene about carbon farming in the EU legislation with Hannes Böttcher. We will dive deeper into silvicultural practices with Jurij Diaci. Then we will ask very important questions about additionality, permanence, and leakage prevention. And last but not least, we will go into what do we know about measuring carbon in forests. And with this, I would like now to introduce all the lovely scientists that contributed to the study. So first of all, we have Tommaso Chiti. He's an associate professor at the University of Tuscia. He holds a PhD in soil science and climatology from the University of Florence and works on the understanding the impact of sustainable land management practices on the soil system, particularly in the LULUCF sector. Tommaso has published widely and also contributed to many international projects. Next, we have Hannes Böttcher. He's a senior researcher at the Oeko-Institut in Berlin. He holds a PhD degree from the University of Freiburg. And Hannes has also worked and published an enormous amount of research on biomass potential, sustainability criteria for the use of biomass, but also modeling on forest management option and the implications for the carbon balance. Thirdly, we have Jurij Diaci. He's a professor in silviculture at the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia, and he has a PhD from the ETH in Zurich in forest regeneration ecology. His research focuses on silviculture, forest ecology, and old-growth forest and close-to-nature forest management, or forest ecology, ecological forestry. He has led many national and research projects and contributed to several international ones and published also widely. Then we have Oliver Frings. He's a PhD researcher in economics at AgroParisTech and the Bureau of Theoretical and Applied Economics in Nancy in France. But currently, Oliver is a visiting scholar at the University of Cambridge. Oliver explores how policy instruments, including market-based instruments, such as, for example, voluntary carbon markets, can effectively promote forest management strategy that support climate and biodiversity goals. Last but surely not least, we have Miguel Zavala. He's a professor of ecology at the University of Alcalá in Madrid. He holds a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from Princeton University. Miguel's research focuses on mathematical and computational ecology to understand the functioning of social ecosystems and design sustainable solutions to the current environmental and social conflicts. Miguel has coordinated many research projects, nationally and internationally, and published an enormous amount of scientific articles, including in the most prestigious journals, Science and Nature, to name a few. So welcome, everyone. I'm really happy that you're with us today. And I would like to give now the floor to Tommaso Chiti to introduce the first topic, carbon farming, and give us a quick study overview. Thank you. Tommaso, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Helga, for the nice introduction, and good afternoon to everyone. As Helga introduced me, I'm Tommaso Chiti from University of Tuscia, Italy, and I'm going to provide you with a brief introduction to carbon farming and a quick study overview. When we talk about carbon farming, we need to start from December 2021, when the European Commission adopted the Communication on Sustainable Carbon Cycles, where for the first time it was introduced the concept of carbon farming, namely a green business model that reward the actors of the land sector for implementing management practices leading to carbon sequestration in the living biomass, dead organic matter, and soil, so enhancing carbon sequestration and or reducing the release of the carbon to the atmosphere, so emission reduction. Later on, in 2024, it was approved the CRCF regulation, namely the carbon removal and carbon farming regulation, setting the framework of all the carbon farming activities. Carbon farming is one of the instruments in place from the European Union to reach the climate target of 2030 and 2050. It includes practices such as afforestation, improved forest management, agroforestry, and the sustainable use of the soil in the agricultural system. It is different from other activities also in place to reach the targets, such as the permanent storage, which basically include carbon capture and storage, or the storage of carbon in wood product, namely the use of wood-based material in construction to replace intensive fossil fuel material. So when we are talking about carbon farming, we are talking basically about two different types of activities. Activities which lead to carbon sequestration, so the removal of CO2 from the atmosphere and the permanent storage in soil and the living biomass, or activities which imply an emission reduction, such as a more efficient use of fertilizer or the rewetting of peatlands. The CRCF regulations strongly rely on a robust certification system based on the so-called quality criteria. Quality is an acronym that stands for quantification, so carbon removal needs to be precisely measured. Additionality, all the carbon removal activities need to go beyond the common standard practices. Liability, the carbon removed needs to be stored for a certain number of years in one of the different pools present in a forest ecosystem, for instance. And last but not least, sustainability. So the carbon removal activities need to have a positive impact also on other environmental objectives or ecosystem services, such as increasing the biodiversity or having a positive impact on the water cycle. So based on these premises, in 2024, we produced for EFI the first report on the carbon farming in the forestry sector. Basically, we analyzed the most widely used sustainable practices in the forestry sector to understand their potentiality in terms of carbon sequestration in both the above ground biomass and the soil system. Besides, these practices were also evaluated to understand their compliance with the EU quality criteria. Here you can see some of the practices we analyzed within the report and their impact on the above ground biomass and on the soil system. As you can see, if we talk about above ground biomass, the evaluated practices have a positive impact. But some consideration needs to be done, particularly, for instance, since we are talking about forest dynamic, the time needed by these practices to deliver climate benefits, which are always in the medium and in the long term. Similarly to the soil, you can see that these practices have a positive or a null impact. But also in this case, we need to consider that most of the forest soils already start from a high level of soil organic carbon, so it is not so easy to increase that amount, their amount in a short lapse of time. If we look at the practices which are most promising, afforestation, agroforestry, and peatland management are those that hold the highest mitigation potential for both above ground biomass and soil carbon. Here we have an insight in one of the climatic areas in which we divided Europe for the purposes of the report. In this case, you can see the Mediterranean area with a graph showing the carbon sequestration rate related to the two main compartments present in the forest, namely the above ground biomass, the green bars, or the soil organic carbon, the orange bars. But apart from evaluating the carbon sequestration rates in these two compartments, in the report there are a lot of consideration related to the implementation of these practices. For instance, agroforestry is undoubtedly enhancing the biodiversity and providing multiple ecosystem services, but at the same time present many challenges, in particular in relation to the measurement of this pool, of these climatic benefits in a system, the agroforest, which can be very diverse. Or the use, for instance, of different tree species. In fact, we could use fast-growing species which can deliver climate benefits in the short time, but in most of the cases are not well climate adapted. Or we could go for slow-growing tree species which are climate adapted but deliver climate benefits on the medium to the long term. So these are some of the many considerations that you can find in the report in relation to the implementation of the different practices. The analysis that we performed in the report allowed us also to identify some of the main challenges related to the implementation of the carbon farming in the forestry sector. In particular, the long and variable time scale to which the different practices deliver climate benefits in relation to the EU targets. The 2030 target is basically tomorrow. For the 2050, so the climate neutrality, still we have a bit of time, but we need to consider the length of the dynamics in the forest ecosystem. Then we need to consider that the carbon in the forest system is not permanent. I mean, it could be re-emitted tomorrow in relation to many different types of disturbances, fire rather than pathogen attack. And there are a series of methodological quantification problems, mainly related to how to measure variation in soil carbon, or in how to set the baseline, namely the data against which the mitigation potential needs to be compared to understand the real benefits. And there are also a series of challenges related to the measurement of the additional ecosystem services that needs to be promoted with the carbon farming, such as how we can measure biodiversity. So to conclude, the success of the implementation of the carbon farming practices in the forestry sector critically depends on the risk to which the forest is exposed and the forest's response to climate change. This means that to get the maximum results and the maximum mitigation benefits for the implementation of the practices, this needs to be tailored locally, considering the local conditions. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you, Tommaso, for your presentation. I would say we dive immediately deeper into the European Union requirements with Hannes before we take questions. I just want to remind while Hannes is trying to share his screen, we want to remind everyone that we have put up a Padlet where you can put your question directly in. Just click on the plus and put your question to Tommaso or other scientists. So Hannes, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, thank you, Helga, for the introduction, and thank you, Tommaso, for the overview of this study, the report we wrote, and the introduction to the policy. I'm now setting the scene, looking more conceptually at the EU framework, not only the CRCF, but also the other policies around this legislation. And I will start with looking at this policy landscape or policy environment carbon farming is in forestry in the EU is put in. And I will start with my favorite policy, so to say, that I research most, the LULUCF regulation. You know that we have targets in that regulation for 2030 that need to change a declining trend. So we need to increase natural removals in this in the policy in the sector of land use change and forestry. We need to bend the curve, so to say. We need to get from a declining trend that is around 260 million tons currently to really 310 in 2030. That's a requirement by EU policies. And carbon farming is related to that, and I will show how. There are other policies that are addressing biomass as a resource. There's the Renewable Energy Directive, for example, but also nature restoration law that require that biomass is either used for certain purposes or left in the landscape for restoration. There's generally the demand for natural carbon dioxide removals that's increasing also in the voluntary markets. So also companies that are managed and member states, of course, have set up incentive schemes where such kind of natural removal credits are being traded. And of course, looking at the land manager, the forester, the farmer, it's increasingly challenging to get an oversight of who is actually asking for my services. So am I now a carbon farmer? Am I a original farmer or common farmer? Am I a forester, or what do I produce? What kind of ecosystem services, and who pays what for it? And where actually do I get the best price and get a living from the services I provide? I will touch upon 3 policy aspects of carbon farming in the EU forests that I find important. This is just a selection. I will first talk about visibility of carbon farming in national greenhouse gas inventories, and I will tell you why this is important. Then about the competitiveness of carbon farming as a carbon dioxide removal technology in markets that are managing or demanding these kind of services, carbon storage. And I will talk about carbon farming and how it eventually needs to support multiple policy objectives as a conclusion. So first, to visibility of carbon farming. Why is this important? Well, EU member states struggle to achieve national targets. I was referring to the 310 million tons of CO2 removals a net target in 2030. But there's also net zero accounted LULUCF targets in the period before that, 21 to 25, we're currently in. There's a budget to be kept in or keep the net emissions in for 26 to 29. and then the individual targets that most people are aware of. And the member states have really now in mind and try hard to think about measures to achieve these targets, to steer the sector towards these targets. And carbon farming is supposed to be one of the mechanisms or tools towards achieving the targets as a funding instrument, but also to improve greenhouse gas reporting, because a lot of data is being generated also by these activities, by the projects in the field. And one could think that, well, when we know more about forests in a particular region where projects are implemented, then we should also have better data for greenhouse gas reporting. However, there are certain challenges with the visibility of carbon farming activities at project level in greenhouse gas inventories. And these are due to the scope, because one is project related, while the other is a sector target. So we have different scopes here where different emission sources and things are included. We have also an issue of scale. There's field or forest level measurements versus whole country level estimates. So in total, the methods are quite different. There's in situ measurements at project level, and also involving LCA methodologies, so life cycle analyses, versus national greenhouse gas inventory methods that have typically based on surveys on large scale inventory methods to estimate values for the whole country and not just single projects. So there's a discrepancy there that needs to be overcome, and it's not clear how these projects will be visible in the greenhouse gas inventories of the countries, which is important if they should count also towards achieving the target. What about competitiveness of carbon farming in carbon dioxide removal markets? Well, it's important to mention that the CRCF market will be differentiating between the permanent, so more geological storage, and temporary storage. So here already there's a differentiation, and there will be a price difference for those more temporary storage opportunities of carbon. Well, one could say that carbon farming in forests is maybe cheaper than those permanent storage options, but actually there's also the risk that these costs are underestimated because, for example, opportunity costs are not included because technology is not ready to be used, because we have also land use conflicts. We have issues with implementation of these measures and activities. But what is there are the co-benefits that carbon farming, and especially carbon farming in EU forests, can offer that technical carbon dioxide removal options cannot offer. So I think there's a need to generate the demand for these co-benefits to really make them competitive with permanent removals. So one could think about incentive payments where from a national fund or other, maybe also public, private funds, there are payments in markets for ecosystem services. So that we're not just talking about carbon, but really play the card of the co-benefits that carbon farming activities are offering. So in the end, carbon farming needs to support multiple policy objectives, not just the targets we talked about. So there's also there can also be conflicts with the targets. So for example, the LULUCF regulation, of course, requires we are increasing the net removals in the LULUCF sector, which could mean reduced timber harvest, for example, in beech forests. In Germany, it's under discussion. There's also the nature restoration law that requires increasing the resilience of climate change affected forest ecosystems. So already there might be opportunities for carbon farming, but also conflicts. But also a renewable energy directive targets point to the forest and support the use of wood biomass for energy, which can again be in conflict with the other policies. So carbon farming is somewhere in between and probably supporting partly different policies, and there's a need to really make them support as many as possible of these policies. So how can carbon farming in the EU forests be made more effective or make the policies more effective? I think important is to have the funding of such forestry activities closer to the CAP strategic plans, so really to what the countries are actually planning to do in their countries. There's also the nice example of state aid rules that have been changed to increase incentive payments. And there's the example in the German case where a program that's called Climate Adapted Forest Management Plus is supporting forest owners that really want to change from selling timber to selling ecosystem services. And the changes in the state aid rules helped to have this really a premium product in the market of ecosystem services. So to conclude, visibility of carbon farming in national greenhouse gas inventories is, I think, important for all stakeholders, for those who are setting up projects, but also for the member states that need to achieve targets, but it cannot be achieved easily. And therefore, I think also the currently developed CRF methodologies also need to address this challenge that we need to overcome the different scales and scopes. Regarding competitiveness of carbon farming in carbon dioxide removal markets, this requires a focus on other ecosystem services. So let's try to value more that carbon farming provides other ecosystem services than just carbon storage. And there needs to be a market for that. For example, through having incentive payments combined with voluntary or compliance markets for such kind of services. And finally, carbon farming needs to support multiple policy objectives. That's trivial, but how to do that? I think one step is to clearly define what the credits can be used for. So, for example, for compliance use, for contribution claims, or for getting access to subsidy schemes instead of offsetting, that is more meant for permanent removals. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
For let us diving deeper into the EU legislation and also setting out these interesting policy conclusions. I think they're very relevant for a lot of policymakers. Now, let's see, Shan, do we have questions? Are you sharing the screen to show us the paddlers? So there's different questions now to Hannes. Maybe, Hannes, you can pick one which you would like to start.
Yeah, let's start with the, I think the first one, what different data are involved in greenhouse gas inventories compared to project level? Well, typically in reporting of greenhouse gas emissions and removals in forests, countries are relying on national forest inventories. And these are plots measured in the forest that are 4 by 4 kilometers or smaller dimension, where then a few trees are measured. And this is a good sampling strategy for the whole forest area. While projects need to differentiate really at the stand level. So they are measuring more forest patches of a different state that are in a certain state. So a middle-aged pine forest. So they have to capture that this forest is in a certain initial condition, and then you're managing in the project the forest and you're following that particular stand. While greenhouse gas inventory methods are more representative for the entire area, at the project level, it's focusing on forest stands. Maybe that's in a nutshell. the difference.
Clear answer to this question. Can you take a second question, maybe? We have two more.
Contribution of carbon farming to national carbon storage goals for forests. So in the case of Germany, the question is, what is the realistic contribution of carbon farming to achieving the ambitious carbon storage goals in Germany's Climate Act? Yeah, important question. What can be done in forests? Well, the most manageable carbon stock in forests is the living biomass, living and dead biomass. So to achieve the targets fast, a reduction of harvest is the most effective one. Well, this comes at a cost. We are when we're reducing harvest, we don't have the material that is harvested anymore available. So we need to think carefully both which forests are we actually harvesting? So are these forests that are anyway close to collapsing? Then I think it's safe to harvest those forests and make use of the wood in other forms as wood products. But there are also forests that are relatively intact and can capture more carbon in the future as living trees, and those are currently harvested for biomass use for bioenergy, for wood fuel. And of course, it's important to focus on those forests that are stable enough to take more carbon up. And so this is beech forests that are currently, to a large degree, harvested for energy. This is just one option. I don't say that this is one we need to go for immediately, but it's striking that we are burning a lot of wood from forests that are actually still accumulating carbon, where the carbon would be more stable in those forests. That's one option. Yeah, and others, especially maybe the colleagues will talk more about the opportunities in other countries.
Okay, thank you very much, Hannes. I think there are more questions are coming in. We will leave them for later. We go back to this. But I think we would like to continue now with Jurij and then come back to the question. Maybe you also could look at the question in the meanwhile. Some could be probably also answered in writing. So Jurij, please let us dive a little bit more into silvicultural practices now and how suitable those are. Can you please share your screen? It's not shared yet.
Yes, just a moment.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's now okay?
Yes, fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, hello everyone. My perspective will be from the field of silviculture and from practice. I'll focus on balancing forest management and carbon sequestration. I present possible measures and also some dilemmas. A range of silvicultural practices can be implemented or adapted to enhance carbon storage in managed forest. However, it is important to consider the variation of silvicultural approaches across Europe, from industrial forestry to close to nature forestry. Moreover, about 60% of forests are private, and the owners rely on the income. Additionally, EU promotes multifunctional forest management, which integrates biodiversity conservation, hydrogeological protection, and socio-economic benefits. Thus, carbon farming measures would vary across the continent and should not be maximized on the detriment of the other forest functions. Silvicultural measures can enhance carbon sequestration both directly and indirectly. Indirectly, many practices support carbon storage by promotion of site-adapted, vigorous, long-lived trees and mixed resilient stands. For example, thinning initially decreases growing stock, but on the long term contributes to the better availability of resources and thus better vitality and mechanical stability of stands. Verifying the additionality of these indirect effects is challenging. In contrast, direct measures, as for example afforestation, contribute more explicitly to carbon storage and can often be verified using forest databases, particularly in countries with detailed forest inventories. Afforestation is highly effective for above and below ground carbon storage, especially in the Mediterranean, with decreasing rates in temperate and boreal zones. Land use competition limits afforestation potential, requiring careful planning. In forest-rich countries, afforestation can focus on degraded areas such as landfills, mining sites, post-industrial areas, eroded land, or drained peatlands. This is one example of afforestation in forest-poor Albania. New forests there support carbon sequestration, biodiversity, and reduce erosion. Changing species composition can boost carbon storage in degraded forest, but has limited impact in well-managed ones. If we use softwoods, we could lose biodiversity, reduce resilience, and we can have altered forest functions, especially if using non-local species. Slower growing hardwoods often have higher wood density, meaning they can sequester as much carbon as faster growing conifers. Carbon market incentives should not favor fast-growing softwoods over natural hardwoods. For example, converting coppices with standards and degraded forests can enhance carbon storage on the upper photos. Restoring monocultures to mixed uneven age stands may also contribute, though quantifying CO2 gains is challenging. European forest strategy favors mixed species stands and a shift from clear-cutting to continuous cover forestry. CCF enhances resilience to disturbances, pests, and diseases, while ensuring steady carbon input to the forest floor. Here we can see photos of transformation of conifer plantations in Ireland. In only 20 years, they achieved kind of mixed uneven age forest, improving biodiversity, stability, and resilience. Reducing harvest intensity or prolonging rotations can increase carbon stocks, but older, larger trees are more susceptible to disturbances, risking carbon losses. Lower harvesting in one area might also cause deforestation elsewhere. It's leaking. But many European forests successfully maintain high growing stock while balancing for regeneration and wood quality. For example, many Pro Silva exemplary forests. But halting management is rarely an effective strategy and requires careful consideration. But here is one example from the Alps. Some managed natural forests grow on very steep slopes where they do not directly protect infrastructure or buildings and have experienced few disturbances in the past. In such areas, forest management is not very profitable. So these stands could be designated as eco-cells, excluded from active management. This approach is already being implemented in Slovenia. In Northern Europe, forest growth is often nitrogen limited, making fertilization beneficial. But in saturated areas with nitrogen in Atlantic Europe, in Central Europe, its effectiveness for carbon farming is questionable. Liming was often used to decrease acidity of soils, but the effects on carbon sequestration are not clear enough. So all this requires additional research. To conclude, forest management has many direct and indirect effects on carbon stocks. When deciding which measure to implement, we have to focus on site conditions, stand characteristics, and also all the other forest functions. Halting management can harm forest functions and reduce carbon stocks. Therefore, policies should carefully select areas with little or no forest management. This is kind of increasing trend in Europe and a little bit worrying. And we should focus in particular on supporting multifunctional silvicultural practices that enhance carbon sequestration along with broad environmental benefits. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Jurij, for your very clear words. And it is really interesting to hear that sustainable managed forest here, they might be less prone to increase carbon storage. At the same time, it's exactly what we need. And there is, of course, forests out there that are not in this status, that need to become more resilient. But now we would like to talk more about leakage prevention, additionality, and permanence. I can see that more questions came in the meantime, also to Jurij and Tommaso. We will come to this in a moment. Oliver, the floor is yours now.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, nice. Okay, yes, I'm Oliver Frings, and I'm now going to talk about additionality, permanence, and leakage prevention. I cannot see my slides properly. Okay. What do we know from an economic and conceptual perspective? Okay. First of all, why is carbon farming actually economically interesting? It was already being talked about, especially by Hannes. It has lower costs compared to industrial carbon capture and storage technologies, and it's an attractive investment due to potential co-benefits like biodiversity or water protection or also recreational values. However, it's quite risky for three main reasons. Firstly, uncertainty around real emission reductions. About real emission reductions or lacking additionality. Secondly, carbon stored in forests is vulnerable, as already been stated, or non-permanent potentially. And thirdly, emission reductions may shift elsewhere or so-called market leakage occurs. And these risks led to, probably not only that, but also that led to issued nature-based carbon credits fell by 50% between 2022 and 2023. Which is quite a shocking number, I would say. So at first I will go a bit deeper into additionality. So the concept is that only carbon savings that exceed the baseline or the expected business as usual scenario count as real environmental impact or real carbon impact. And this matters because if no additionality is achieved, we don't actually have real-time benefits of all sorts of projects we're looking at. However, we have a common issue, which is called inflated baselines. So basically exaggerated expected emissions or carbon losses in the counterfactual. So in the business as usual scenario, so in the assumption of what would happen without the intervention, and this leads to massive overcrediting. There was a quite big study published recently where they looked at a couple of hundred projects with remote sensing and checked the surrounding areas to like in so-called ex post valuations. And they found that for awarded deforestation credits, only about 25% of them globally actually led to genuine additional carbon benefits. And for improved forest management, they could actually not find any significant difference. They mainly looked for that at US American projects. This leads me to permanence. This means that stored carbon may return to the atmosphere due to disturbances such as pests, forest fires, storms, or also just like harvesting activities, breaching the contract. And the literature insights here, also what has been said before, and also what is already done in the CRCR framework, is to differentiate between temporary and permanent tools or emission reductions. However, even if we consider only temporary emission reductions in so-called ton-year accounting, so we only account for carbon which is currently being stored in the project, and as soon as the project ends, also the credits have to be replaced by new credits. This can also lead to significant benefits. Basically, it just pushes the peak warming potential of the atmosphere a bit to the future. So we just buy a bit more time in order to mitigate emissions in other sectors. And the last major risk is market leakage. I would say this is maybe the most interesting one because it's vastly overlooked. When you look at national scale offsetting schemes, carbon-based offsetting schemes, it's usually not acknowledged at all. This includes, for instance, the label Bas Carbone in France. They don't really care, they don't really account for, especially international market leakage. The one in California accounts for about 20%, but as I will show you later, the actual estimations are quite higher. The British one also don't really account for it. So the idea here is that we have that supply restrictions in one forest drive up prices, market prices, thus triggering more logging in other regions. So if I protect one forest in Europe or like vast areas, but the demand for wood stays constant or even increases because of the green transition, we want to build, for instance, more timber-based houses, or we want to use more biomass for energy, for instance, this would just lead the logging to be transferred elsewhere. And the estimations from the literature from the market leakage range between 50 and 90%. So up to 90% of the kind of restricted harvest in forest offsetting projects is replaced just to other regions, which is a huge problem because it basically undermines the net benefit of carbon sequestration projects or offsetting projects. And the economic reality is, once we reduce harvesting rates, we will see some sort of replacement. So what to do about it? For additionality, I think it's pretty straightforward. We should set conservative and evidence-based deadlines and regular exposed third-party verifications. I think that's very relevant. So not only set the baselines before and assume them to be realistic, but really go afterwards and check with surrounding areas, similar areas, to see if there's actually a difference in the carbon storage and also whatever benefits we also look at between the project area and the non-project areas surrounding. Basically what the large studies on the matter did also. And for permanence, we should establish buffer pools. So let's say 10, 20%, this is a matter of debate, but holding some credits back from the market, which are being generated before. And in case there's a project failure, we replace the credits granted by these projects by the buffer pool and then replenish the buffer pool. And secondly, only grant temporal credits. One option for that is ton-year accounting. So what I said before, we only account for the tons in the years that the project is actually working or like it's actually in place. And then as soon as the project ends, also these credits cease to exist and have to be replaced by new projects. And this will basically just push the global warming a bit to the future and gives us more time for adjusting other sectors. And for leakage, the main thing is here designing projects that maintain the wood supply, so not restrict harvesting in any way, or we have to reduce wood demand. This is what Hannes referred to, for instance, with the Renewable Energy Directive. In that case, it would mean, for instance, to stop subsidizing or reduce the subsidizing of wood for energy consumption, for instance. And in general, we should assume high leakage as a default in projects, unless it's reliably disproven, or we can really, and this could also, for instance, include that actually no harvesting is altered in any way. And this entire thing leads me to one dilemma we have in all voluntary carbon markets, or voluntary nature markets, let's say. It's the accessibility versus rigidity dilemma. Because rigid standards ensure credibility and real impact. However, they also increase costs and limit participation on the landowner side. And when we have very accessible rules, we have low entrance barriers. So we have a lot of potential forest owners to participate, or forest managers. However, we risk overcrediting, and this weakens the trust on the buyer side. And this is what happens at the moment from how I would describe it. And moving to one easy direction can undermine integrity or scale of markets. So the extreme outcomes would be if the regulation is too lax, then we have buyer distrust and the market collapses eventually. If it's too strict, we have low supply, high costs, and the market might be very small or even collapse too because there's not enough participants in the market or the credits are too expensive to be competitive on the market. I would pin that down on this graph. We have two axes here. On the y-axis, we have market viability, and on the x-axis, we have accessibility versus rigidity. And here in the blue area, we have a viable market condition, and in the red area, we have unviable market conditions. And I would argue that at the moment, we are way too far on the accessibility side when it comes to global voluntary carbon markets, especially the Vera and these kind of things. And in order to make it to the viable market condition, we have to create a more rigid market, which is actually producing that we don't see the studies anymore showing that 25% only of avoided deforestation products are only additional. Like it should be like closer to 100%, let's say. And to achieve that, we have to have more rigid market conditions and legislation. So my key takeaways would be, at first, what I said in the beginning already, issued nature-based carbon credits dropped by 50% in 2022 to 2023. This signals a declining trust in forest offsets. And forest offsets are economically attractive, but of high risk because of lacking additionality potentially, because of non-permanence or market leakage. And this is why we have to adopt rigid standards to ensure real impact and investor confidence. There's also one issue is when we have very high risk in any sort of financial assets, usually investors demand very high returns because to kind of hedge for the risks, to make up for the risks. And this also will drive up prices in the end. And or like reduces the market to scale. And lastly, forest carbon projects can deliver valuable co-benefits. And so we should prioritize multifunctional carbon farming practices, as also some of the other presenters already mentioned. So in the conclusion, the credibility of carbon markets on a global scale is at the moment at stake. And the new development of carbon markets should therefore focus on integrity over accessibility at the moment, because otherwise the market might collapse at some point because the demand on the buyer side is just diminishing at some point. Okay, thanks a lot, and I'm curious for your questions.
Thank you very much, Oliver, for this clear messaging, especially towards the end. We would now like to open again the floor to you and Jurij. Let's have a look at our Padlet. Shan, can you please share the screen again? Excellent. So currently there is no question for Jens. Sorry, for Oliver. And Jens is also co-author, so we put him also in the Padlet. Because he's here. So we have two questions to Jurij. Jurij, would you like to pick a question here that you would like to answer first?
Perhaps the second one about potential land use conflict in Europe between, let's say, carbon farming and traditional timber use. I see many possibilities of conflicts. That's why we have really to focus on kind of regional planning to discuss forest use from different perspectives and on the region, not only on the level of owner. And I believe it's possible to overcome conflicts, but also we need to have politicians in the same room, the politicians who are discussing or favoring, let's say, carbon farming, then biodiversity, then let's say green focus on, let's say, green development in Europe. So in a way, we have to sit on the same table and discuss this not within separate departments on the European level and country level, but really on the same, let's say, in the same room, and to find compromises. Just for example, one example where carbon farming is not possible, that we understand these differences. For example, we have a lot of protection forests in the mountain areas of Europe, and there managing is important to decrease the coarse woody debris, because the coarse woody debris that gets into the water system, into the torrents, these are driftwood, and we could have really serious problems when the flooding occurs. So there are some areas where management is really necessary. But on the other hand, if we have kind of natural forest and it's on a really extreme slope, and we offer a manager kind of subsidy so that he can cover the income from the forest. For example, sometimes this is only 10, 15 cubic meter euros per cubic meter. He would be happy and he would stop managing, and this could be, let's say, biodiversity island, carbon farming island for 30, 40 years, if this is really a natural forest. So we really have to look very carefully for, let's say, combinations of stand, site, and other forest functions. So this requires really kind of teamwork.
Okay, excellent.
Okay.
Would you like to take another question?
Yes,
but maybe a short answer.
Okay. Okay, carbon storage versus fire prevention. This is important for the Mediterranean part, and our experience from Slovenia is that we are behind with conversion of pine forest, of pine plantations. They are very susceptible to the fires. So we should invest a little bit in those forests to convert them to natural forest with more, let's say, hardwoods, and also to take care that the forest is not so close to the houses, how we store firewood and so on. So I believe it's possible to combine, but we have to separate kind of areas with housing, infrastructure, be careful about the prevention of fire, and also convert many pine plantations that are not natural in this area and introduce hardwoods again. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Jurij, there's another question that might be able to be answered quickly. The one from Ljubljana about the stability of carbon stock versus increase of carbon stock. Can you maybe add something here as well?
Which one is this? I don't...
Just the last question. Did we move to a scenario where we might have to prioritize stability of carbon stock by adapting forests rather than increasing carbon stocks?
For sure, stability of carbon stocks is important. And in forestry, we are, especially in close to nature forestry, we are striving for higher growing stocks because they influence forest climate, which is very beneficial for natural regeneration. We are working with natural regeneration. And this forest climate is also very beneficial for the quality of wood. So within close to nature forestry, we are focused on relatively high growing stocks. So there are many examples where we have, let's say, 400, even 500 cubic meters of growing stock. But we are very careful which trees to favor. So should be from the, let's say, natural to the site, and should be also trees with longevity. In Europe, for example, in last 10 years, 20 years, a lot of oaks were planted also within close to nature forestry to adapt to the future climate. So I believe with carefully selecting trees, working with natural regeneration, is also possible to work with a bit higher growing stock and also having the risk of, let's say, stand replacing disturbance relatively low. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jurij. Of course, forests differ a lot in Europe. Now let's go to Oliver, and we can also have a look at if Jens is there. So Oliver and Jens, would you like to take one or the other question here to answer them directly?
Yeah, sure. I could start with the first one. I think it's for many reasons that I can first read the question again. Why do policymakers continue to legitimize forest offsets when evidence shows that climate benefits are often illusionary? And what would it take to shift focus towards absolute emission cuts instead? I mean, that's a very tricky question. I think policymakers focus on it because it still seems like harvesting low-hanging fruits, which I would argue is not necessarily actually the case. In some cases, it is probably the case. For instance, in Mediterranean areas, to avoid forest fires, I think that's definitely a low-hanging fruit in that sense, which is very beneficial both for local communities and also for the climate. Though I'm also skeptical about the vast scalability and the ambition behind some policymakers. But in the end, it's a political decision. It's not my role to judge that. And I think that still for certain cases, carbon farming can be quite a good tool. We can, basically fulfill multiple objectives at once. When it comes to the next one, high potential, is there potential for carbon farming to provide the high return needed to attract investment? If yes, how would this market look like? This is something for me, I would more argue we should not aim for that. Because if we have, it's putting a lot of pressure on ecosystems in the end, potentially. For instance, people would come up potentially with plantation forestry or stuff like that. And I think that would be not what we should aim for, and instead we should reduce the risk so that the demand for these high returns is not there or is a bit reduced. So this is why I focus so much on the rigidity part, on the credibility part, because I think also, I mean, this is something to be studied. I cannot really back that with any quantitative knowledge, but I would guess that it's difficult to achieve these extremely high returns. So I think the more viable way is to just reduce the risks, and there are tools for that provided also in the literature. For viability, one more question, or otherwise?
Yes, one last question. For the sake of time, we can come back if you have more time later.
The viability versus accessibility diagram, I think that's quickly answered because looking at your graph, viability, accessibility, rigidity, would you place the current state of carbon market in the same way for the projects in European forests for the tropical forest? I would say no. Based on the literature and on these kind of ex post valuations, you see usually that in general, in industrialized countries, you see higher rates of compliance. You still see similar problems, but it's looking a little bit better. That's what I can say to that.
Okay, thank you so much. Maybe in the meantime, you can think about how to answer the last question. And I would like to now give the floor to Miguel. And here we would like to learn a little bit about measuring carbon in the forest. How is it actually done? So Miguel, the floor is yours.
Okay.
Okay, Miguel, Shan is sharing it for you. So
All right, thanks a lot.
You just tell her next slide.
Okay, just next slide, please. Yes, well, sorry, apologies about this this informatic problem. Well, this slide is I'm going to talk about from the ecological perspective. Why are we here? This general graph tells us how actually we're working with social ecological systems. Forests in Europe are mostly human-made constructions that deliver some, they have some structure and deliver some, has some functions, and those functions turn into services. And those services are modified by human policies and pressure. So next slide. So the climatic services are part of this feedback loop that I mentioned before. We all know that. Usually, I put this slide because forests have one negative side, that sometimes forest management is associated to this negative side of deforestation, because deforestation is around 15% of emissions, especially in the tropics, but because of changes in land use from forests to agricultural or other uses. But actually, forests are also linked very heavily to the sinks at the global scale, and this almost 30% of the carbon sink is also the reason we're here. So we link this carbon capacity of forests to sequester and maintain carbon as one of these climatic services. And there has been some policies related to these climate regulation services, as we know, which is all these mitigation policies that we're here because of these mitigation policies. Next slide. In science, a very important aspect is quantifying things. If we speak of something, I think this is a famous quote by Lord Kelvin, if we need to know something, we need to quantify it. So what do we know about carbon in forests? I think it's important. There's no magic measurement, but I think that in any other aspects in ecology, it's very important to define the spatial scale or extent at which we want to measure this, quantify this process, and also the temporal scale. The good news is that there's a lot of information at all these combination of scales, and the bad news is that there's no single measurement for all, and also it's like a jigsaw. To have an objective measurement of carbon in the forest, we probably need to combine different sources. So for example, in this graph, all these graphs, by the way, are in the report, so you can see them in more detail. If we talk about local measurements and short temporal scales, we have forest management data. Usually foresters take records of this, so we have very nice historical databases or prescriptions. More sophisticated data come from eddy flux towers that take even hour to minute exchanges in gas exchange fluxes. But of course, you can integrate them, and we already have different initiatives from scientists around the world. Just they have assembled this, so you can extrapolate all these measurements in the space and time, obviously up to a decade or so at most. If you want to go from local stand measurements to regional scales, we have national forest inventories, which give you a very good idea. It's updated every 10 years of changes in biomass stocks. There's also some soil data in label as 4 here, which are never good enough, of course, because the soil measurement carbon in the soil is tricky, and we don't have large scale measurements, but there's some information that can be complemented with local inventories. If we want to define longer time scales in time, dendrochronology, tree ring data is also a very good option. And of course, if we want to give a continuous spatial coverage of some of these measurements, we have ground remote sensing like terrestrial laser systems and so on. And of course, airborne and spaceborne remote sensing give us a much better opportunity to scale up some stand measurements to the regional scale. And the state of the art is usually a combination of some of these measurements. Typically, spaceborne remote sensing and forest inventory data, for example. So this jigsaw I mentioned in the beginning, you can probably provide some good estimates of carbon stock balance in European forest. Next slide, please. Then usually in most of these ecological processes are dynamic. For example, here in the bottom, the biomass in the forest is always a dynamic balance. You have tree growth and ingrowth, but you have always losses through harvesting or disturbances, etc. In this graph, you can see in blue and in violet the different models that we can use to quantify that dynamically and project in a space and time how carbon stocks and carbon sequestration evolve over time. Yield growth models are a very classical way of approaching this. They were designed for timber purposes, but they can also be used to estimate biomass and carbon sequestration. They are empirical and work at the stand local level. If we want to include size distribution, which is usually convenient, there are also a generation of dynamic, usually partial differential equation models that describe stand dynamics or even landscape dynamics over time. Next slide, please. Probably many of you know this individual-based model, which are the classical models like Java Forest or Sorti, that describe the dynamics of forest over time, including species interactions. These are and disturbances. These are, of course, a very interesting option. They're sometimes difficult to parameterize, but the field is quite advanced, and in most European forests, you can use some of these models. So if we're talking about long-term resilience and long-term carbon stocks, it's important to consider all these interactions, including tree growth, mortality, etc. Next slide, please. And then if we want to increase in this in horizontal axis, we want to more physiologically driven models, either at the local scale, can be like standard scale models, or can be global, even global models like dynamic global vegetation models. This may be a little bit intimidating for private companies or for empirical foresters, but actually the field is very well developed. There are very good models already working, and it's important to intensify the research transfer and collaboration among scientists and stakeholders. Why do we need sometimes physiologically driven models to estimate carbon fluxes? Well, because, for example, CO2 increment, the carbon dioxide is increasing concentration in the atmosphere, and sometimes empirical models are not enough because the growth climate relationship are changing over time because of CO2 fertilization effects. So all these models, on all these observations, of course, we're not going to resolve this in this talk, but there's a strong science that I would say that carbon farming wouldn't be limited by data and by models. There's knowledge enough to work on this. Next slide, please. Then I wanted to talk a little bit about the importance of scale in the implementation and some trade-offs between carbon farming and biodiversity and ecosystem services. First of all, I wanted to show this carbon tunnel vision, which basically tells us that it's important sometimes in environmental policies not to focus uniquely on carbon, because especially in the Mediterranean, for example, and in other countries as well, but water, for example, can be more important than water provision than carbon fixation. So we need to consider a broad scale and consider likely trade-offs. Here, I want to show some likely scenarios of trade-offs between biodiversity and carbon. For example, we can have a high biodiversity, but a low carbon sequestration. This is, for example, my university is in based on an anthropic steppe. Many people come here for bird watching, but carbon is very low. But it's a human-made anthropic steppe. But there are many birds and a high wildlife, but carbon is not necessarily high. We can have a lose-lose option. We can have a degraded landscape with low biodiversity and low carbon. But we can also have very high carbon at a local scale with intensive plantations that may not be resilient or can have a fire risk or even and have higher water consumption. So there are some trade-offs. And there's, of course, we have to find the win-win options with at a local level, maybe more related to multifunctional approaches or mature forests also, although this is a controversial concept, especially in the Mediterranean. The concept of mature forest is not necessarily linked to age. It's also linked to age structure and the management system, etc. Next slide. This is to visualize. It's a very simplistic approximation, but you can see you can have low carbon and high biodiversity you can have both lose-lose options also of degraded ecosystems, win-loss option with high carbon stocks and some losses for some species in biodiversity, and some win-win options in some more multifunctional landscapes. But then it's important, next slide, please. Because I refer to that as local options, it's very important to have a regional and landscape perspective, I think, in carbon farming and in any management sustainable approximation. We have very two clear options when we confront land use planning, which is a land sparing option, which I associated more to North America, in which we intensify the uses in some regions, but we liberate like national parks in other regions. But the European tradition is also very linked to land sharing options, which I think are a very good way of maintaining functionality and balancing these trade-offs between biodiversity and ecosystem services, and also including carbon. Because yes, that's fine. Shan, you can go to the next one. Because don't forget that in ecology, carbon actually is the energy, is the primary energy cycle. So usually a high carbon in an ecosystem, it means a high energy flow that can translate into other food webs. And so in general, mitigation targets are aligned with other conservation targets, although it can be more complex than that. This is some very interesting result by Bart Moyes in another European Forest Institute report about biodiversity, which give us different options between how to combine land sparing and land sharing options. In the left extreme of the graph, you can see a landscape divided in forest reserves and in forest plantations. This would be fine, but I think the European tradition, we are more used to intermediate options in which we can combine a strict conservation with intensive production with land sharing options. I think that socially and economically and ecologically, it would be a much better options, including carbon farming, and also giving more local consumption. Next slide, please. Yes, and so in conclusion, I've learned a lot by listening to the other speakers and participating in this report. I think it's important to consider together mitigation and adaptation. First of all, mitigation doesn't strictly depend on us, because other countries are not necessarily going to compile the objectives. I'm not being pessimistic or optimistic, but being realistic, adaptation is also very important, because even if mitigation objectives are not fulfilled, I think adapting ecosystem, making them more resilient, is necessary, and it's and so I think these carbon farming markets should be linked to these resilience bonuses we mentioned, right? Because mitigation also in the long term requires ecosystems that are not prone to wildfires and other disturbances. So in a way, adaptation, I think, should be in hand to mitigation. So that's all. Sorry about the technical problems today.
Thank you, Miguel. It was really interesting now to dive deeper into how to measure carbon and what different measurements are there. Let's have a quick look at our Padlet. I think there is also a question for you already. Shan, can you please share the screen again? So what about this question? Can you maybe answer it, Miguel? And can you turn on your camera, because we haven't seen him. We haven't seen you yet, please.
Yeah, sorry, Helga, the camera is not working for some. I think
sorry. Okay.
Part of my technical problems. It tells me to reinitiate the
no problem.
computer. So let's see if I can.
The question is, I did not see you mention sample plots rather than counterfactual models from GHGEI and project level.
Okay, but I'm sorry about my ignorance, but I'm not sure I understand the question. Sample plots maybe refers to forest inventories. You mentioned.
I can take the question.
Okay. Please.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so I think this refers to also the differences measuring at the project level and in greenhouse gas inventories. That's what the GHGI is for. And in fact, in greenhouse gas inventories, there are no counterfactuals. We are measuring the absolute amount that's going in and out in a certain period of time. And that's a big difference to project level, where you're not only interested in the absolute level, but you're interested in the change in the absolute level compared to a baseline. So this makes also this estimation much more complex because you need to have a reference. Greenhouse gas inventories in that sense are much simpler because they take stock literally and count how much carbon is there and compare it maybe to a historic period, but not to a counterfactual. I don't know if that answers Fiona's question. Happy to give more information.
Okay, Fiona, if it does not answer your question, please ask another one or clarify. Otherwise, let us go to the to-all question first. For peat soils, what should be the maximum depth of peat that should be planted in order to avoid net CO2 emissions? Unfortunately, our peat expert is not here, but maybe, Tommaso, could you take this question?
Yeah, really, I'm not a peat expert, so
Okay.
I'm not able to answer, even because, I mean, peatland is very particular, and the definition and so on is varying country by country, so it's very particular.
Sure. Okay, then unfortunately we have to leave it. But what about the next question? What is the view on the role of the EU in the context of consolidating public finances, considering the uncertainty of changing behavior and achieving additionality, when in many cases, in combination with existing subsidies for non-intervention schemes and deadwood conservation in the context of biodiversity, we are already spending public resources on support of combination of different forest ecosystem services. So maybe this is more a question to the EU, but if somebody can answer this, please, the floor is yours. Otherwise, we leave it.
Oliver, if you want to go, but so this is a question on additionality. So of course, if there's already a high level of general policy requirements for biodiversity conservation, for example, then carbon farming would have to be better than that baseline. And because otherwise, I mean, we're just paying for following the rules, following the law. So in that sense, I agree, but it's also a complex question. Maybe I didn't get all of it.
Yeah,
It's a very complex.
Yeah, also to just add, but it's basically the same again. But I mean, additionality has to be always on 3 pillars, let's say, or on 3 dimensions. It has to be economically additional. So the option which is financed shouldn't have been viable without the financing. Then secondly, it's a legal additionality, so it should always go beyond legal standards. So this would cover that, and then it's also the environmental additionality on top of that. So I think the legal additionality would cover that, as Hannes said already.
Okay, then switching back to Miguel, I see there's another question from Emad. It's to Miguel about how reliable are current carbon quantification models in predicting long-term sequestration, and whose interests are served when uncertainties are downplayed.
Yeah. Well, I think the predictions are reasonably good, depending given there are some models that give error-bounded predictions. So we combine LIDAR and multispectral models and forest inventory. Again, it depends on the scale and the system, but I think it would be reasonably well to compile with the policy requirements. I mean, we don't need very fine-tuned scientific reports. We need some estimates of carbon stocks. So I don't think measuring it should be a problem necessarily. Of course, there's the issue of the root system and in the soil, etc. But I think it's more a scientific challenge than a practical issue. So I think if policy were in place, we can do the job. and the interests who are served when uncertainties are downplayed, I cannot know. But for me, it's more important to be more rigorous about the quantification of the dynamics, for example, given disturbances and all that in the long term, and trade-offs with other ecosystem services. I would work more on that and try to be not too much focus on carbon when water is also an issue, and I would focus more attention on that. Given the policy issues, I cannot say much. Maybe my colleagues can. I don't know if there's some interest. Of course, I'm talking about for Spain because each country also is different here. I think it's very important that we move from a greenwashing option, which probably benefits from this chaos, that because there are forest plantations everywhere and companies are kind of playing with that. If we have a rigorous monitoring system, probably companies will be also happy with that. I mean, that we have a rigorous system of quantification, including these trade-offs and long-term dynamics. I think it's also in companies' interest to supervise in the long term these plantations and be sure they are a carbon stock in the long term, not just for a few years. I don't know if that answers the question.
I thank you very much, Miguel. Unfortunately, we came to an end of the webinar right now. If there is another question added, we try to answer it later on in the writing. I saw also that Tommaso and Hannes have answered some of the questions in writing, which is fantastic. So I would like to thank everyone to be with us today. Becoming carbon neutral by 2050 needs everything, but not only forest. Carbon farming can add to that. And as Oliver, I would borrow your words, said, we sometimes have to overcome certain peaks. Carbon farming can help us overcoming these certain peaks, but we should avoid for sure double accounting and also not use the carbon farming credits to offset, but rather be careful on how we use these credits. Now I would like to thank you all, and I wish you a wonderful afternoon, and stay tuned for our next ThinkForest event very soon. So thank you so much and have a great afternoon. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Helga and Shan.